In this video, we're going to take a look at the 10 greatest classic books ever written in the English language. So without further ado, let's get stuck in, shall we? Hello out there, all my bookish friends in BookTube land. Welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. Now, like I said, this video is a bit of a grand one. It's the 10 greatest classic books written in the English language. Now, I want to say a couple of things up front. One of these was not actually written in English. It's a translation, but you'll see why it's included in the list when we get to it. But secondly, I want to tell you just a little bit about making this video. Making a list of top 10 is pretty impossible because literature is subjective. You can have a certain consensus around which books are great. However, consensus is not literature. So everything in literature is somewhat subjective. But when I thought of 10 books from the English language that are the greatest classics, I thought, which works have an extraordinary impact on later works, or even fictional works which have an impact on the national identity of the British people, and then by extension the English-speaking world, and by extension, because of the influence of Britain and America over the past couple of centuries, the culture of the world at large. And it was based upon those ideas that I came up with this list. And this list will be especially useful to you if you are personally on a project of trying to dig a bit deeper in literature. I've said in other videos, like on how to build your own classic library, that you don't have to read all the books that others consider classics. You want to look at what interests you. So go and have a look at that video where I give you tips on how to build a classic library that suits your personality. But this video is focused for those who are watching who might want to educate themselves in sort of the pedestal foundations of English literature. What I will say is that I'm not going to spend an awful long time on each of them because I could wax lyrical about every single one of these. They are all grand works. But we're just going to take an overview of why I think they are the 10 greats of the English language. Now we're going to go chronologically through the 10 great works of classic literature, and we're going to start with Beowulf. Now you've probably heard of Beowulf, there's been films made of it. It's a grand saga of the Scandinavian, Northern Germanic ilk. But it's English. It was written down in Old Anglo-Saxon in the 10th century. Can you believe 10th century? That's 1,000 years ago that this was first penned down. And the story itself may have gone back a long time before that and just been passed orally. But this is written in Old English, and it's written in a particular way as could be memorable. So if you were a travelling bard, as it were, telling your stories, you could remember it because of the rhythm and the metre and the cadence. Now the story itself takes place in Scandinavia, and we have the king Hrothgar having some problems with in his town, in his place, his land called Heorot, because of an attack by a monster called Grendel. And Grendel keeps coming and knocking through the great hall doors and munching on Hrothgar's men, often when they're asleep, which is a terrible way to be woken up. And so Hrothgar calls for the aid of Beowulf, this warrior. And Beowulf comes along and he takes on the monster Grendel. Now, I don't want to give spoilers away, but later on Grendel's mother turns up and Beowulf is in a bit of a fix there, and there's a dragon that turns up as well. And this saga goes on for quite a long time, but why it's so important and why it's such great literature. One, even reading it in translation, it's moving. It doesn't read just like prose, it is a poem. And so you don't just get the usual casual description of things. Descriptions like the burial of a king or the burning of a king as he's sent off on his boat is done in poetic form. It's the layering on of of beautiful words upon beautiful words upon beautiful words, without so many connectives. But also, when read in the original language, it apparently had a beautiful cadence. It was written in stanzas full of alliteration. I think it was 3,000 odd lines of alliteration. And I'll just give you an example of that. Now, I'm going to use, obviously, the modern translation because I can't read Old Anglo-Saxon. And so a translation doesn't always follow this. But in Old English, it would look more like this all the way through. Just look out for the alliteration. Forth from the fens, from the misty moorlands, Grendel came gliding, God's wrath he bore. Came under clouds until he saw clearly, glittering with gold plates, the mead hall of men. Down fell the door, though fastened with firebands. Open it sprang at the stroke of his paw. Swollen with rage burst in the bale-bringer, flamed in his eyes a fierce light likest fire. Did you hear that constant alliteration, which sort of draws you along? You're sort of galloping along through the story or walking through it. But why Beowulf is such a great epic, a great piece of English literature, is not only is it apparently brilliant in its Old English form, but it gives us the ideas of men and women of the day, how they perceived life, how they perceived, more importantly, the afterlife, death, friendships, loyalty, community. The Anglo-Saxon setup would come crashing down in 1066 when the Normans would invade, and the French-Norman influence would sort of hold sway over the whole land. And those ideas were different to the original English-speaking peoples. Beowulf gives the British their fundamental, most primeval identity of an adventuring people. These are ones that used to come across the sea. They wanted to tame the elements. They had ideas about what made a person great. Loyalty in close-knit community as opposed to the broader bureaucratic national identity. I say national identity, it gave the English a national identity, what it was to be an Anglo-Saxon. And you'll have to read it to find out what happens at the end, because the end is really moving. It's really strong and leaves you almost breathless. And like I say, that was written 1,000 years ago. If you want to get into English literature, then Beowulf is a book at some point that you must read. It is one of the 10 greatest works of English literature. To get to our second greatest work, we need to jump forward 400 years to the age of Geoffrey Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales. The reason the Canterbury Tales is so important to English literature is the way it suddenly diverted its attention. We're coming out of the high romantic era in the Middle Ages. Britain, after the Anglo-Saxons, had the influence of the Normans, and they brought French culture with them, which focused on romance, on the troubadours, on courtly love, and chivalry, those kind of things. And so you had the classic setup of knights and princesses, and heroic deeds of valour in the pursuit of either love or God or spirituality. But when Chaucer wrote the Canterbury Tales, he did something highly unusual. For a start, he writes in English. For the most part up to this point, the people of the court, of whom Chaucer was one, were predominantly, they would still speak Latin and French. But in the past about century, they'd started using English as the main language. And Chaucer writes the Canterbury Tales in this, but it's not so much that he writes in English as what he writes about that's so brilliant. So in the Canterbury Tales, this is the story. There is an inn in Southwark, which is a little quarter of London on the bank of the Thames River. And people who are going on a pilgrimage to the town of Canterbury, they'll come to London as a stopping point before carrying on. And a group of these travellers assemble at the Tabard Inn. But these travellers don't know each other. They wait there to form a group so that they can then walk on to Canterbury together to keep themselves safe from bandits. This was the common practice of the day. Now, amongst them, we're introduced by Chaucer, who is actually a character in the Canterbury Tales. We're introduced to various characters: a knight, his squire, a yeoman who is also sort of like a forester. You've got a prioress, a nun, you've got a monk, you've got a prior, you've got a summoner, you've got a student, like a student from Oxford, and then you've got a good wife, the good wife of Bath, probably the most famous of all the characters in the Canterbury Tales. And the host of the Tabard Inn says, "I'll tell you what, I will come along with you because you're such a great bunch of people. I've enjoyed serving you this evening. And what we're going to do is, on the way, we're all going to tell 2 stories on the way to Canterbury. And on the way back, we'll all tell 2 stories, and it will make the time pass. And whoever gets the title of the best story, they will have a free supper when they get back here. It will be paid for by everybody else." And that's how the story starts. These people are ordinary people. This is not a story about courtly love. This is not a story about the saints necessarily and keeping it all religious. This is not a story about all men clad in armour doing wonderful things for a mistress. They are ordinary people. A student, a yeoman, a friar. They're just common people. A summoner, that's a person who, when someone's in trouble with the courts, the summoner goes and gets them, summons them to court. And they all tell their own different tales, and they give us an insight into life as it was for the ordinary person. But not only that, we identify with them. We actually understand how they feel. They have got a bit of a different perspective because they lived like 600 years ago. So of course they've got a different perspective, but the same emotions, the same things that make you smile and laugh, the irony of life is all in there. But it's magnificent because what happens because of Chaucer is literature suddenly becomes interested in the common person, telling the story of the everyday man and woman. It's revolutionary, really, and this would eventually lead to the novel. The way Chaucer changes the speech of all these characters is something to behold. It's almost like you can step back in time and inhabit the Middle Ages and see things from their perspective and actually realise that you would have done quite well back then. You would have understood how people felt. Our next book is a book you don't hear much of nowadays, and it's Utopia by Thomas More. And Thomas More was the Lord High Chancellor of the realm of England under King Henry VIII. You know, this was some bigwig and a serious intellect as well. Utopia is a novel, but it's passed off as if it's being recounted as real events, which was quite a common thing to do back then. And so we're in the 1500s here. Now, it concerns itself with society and government and politics and philosophy, the governance or the well-governance of the human race and a realm. And the book itself is sort of split into 2 parts. In the first part, Thomas More himself describes going abroad and being introduced to this traveller by his friend. And they get talking about the state of affairs in Europe and the way Europe is managed and the propensity of kings to keep going to war for trivial things. And then there's greed and intrigue and the backstabbing of court and having to play false in order to get anywhere. So all of that's talked about in the first part of the book. And More learns from this traveller that he's been introduced to, that this traveller has spent the last number of years in an island called Utopia. The island's about 200 miles long. It's just off the coast of the mainland, so it's a bit like Britain, really. And he's lived there. Now, in book 2, we have a description of Utopia itself, how the society is set up. And I tell you something, it's amazing. We are talking about like Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto 300 odd years before Karl Marx. We're talking socialism that's written down, communism. And we'll just mention a little bit about this after I've just told you a little more about the story of Utopia. Utopia itself is set up, and what you've got is 56 different cities all through the island of Utopia. They have a maximum population threshold before some will have to be sent to other cities or sent over to the mainland. If there's a decrease in the population on Utopia, they call some of those settlers back. There are, is it 3,000 or 6,000 families are allowed per city? Each family is between 10 and 16 people large. 30 families will nominate someone to be in charge of them, you know, to be sort of like an ombudsman for the families. And then a group of those 30s, the person that they assign, these I can't remember what they're called now, they assign someone else to be over them, and then they elect a prince over the city. And as long as the prince is not tyrannical, he will be prince for life, but if he becomes tyrannical, he can be ousted. There's no private property in Utopia. Nobody wears fine clothes. The fashion industry is done in. Everyone can wear sort of similar kind of clothing, so there's no class distinction. Gold is used to make things like chamber pots or toilets. Slaves are in Utopia, normally because they're criminals or because they're captives of war. But the slaves are shackled with gold. Now, the reason is they know they need gold to trade with the outside world, but they don't want avarice to take over in the country. And so they turn the gold into objects which are demeaning so that no one craves gold. Clever, isn't it? In fact, they do the same with precious gems. They make the children wear precious gems and play with precious gems so that as they grow up, they give up the gems because they think it's childish. Okay? There's so much set up about equality in this system, and the way punishment is meted out and what for. And ultimately, More is making the argument of a utopian world. It's where we get that phrase, a utopian, the perfect ideal system where all men have liberty, equality, fraternity. I think it may even be More that actually said that. I know it's the motto for the French, but I think it was More that said that in this book. But here's the thing, you can read this book in two different ways. Is Thomas More saying that a communist, socialist setup is the utopia, the ultimate thing to aim for? Or is he satirising the idea by saying it's impossible? I'm not going to say any more about this, other than if you read it, all of the names of Utopia and the characters, look them up because they all mean something. And it's, for hundreds of years now, the argument still rages about what side Thomas More was on. Was he for or against the socialist communist idea? The reason it's so important is because he was crystallising the thoughts of a nation who were exploring the outer reaches now, the Americas, and people were beginning to dream of a more liberal society. And a utopia does sum up the grand ideal that all modern day countries try and aspire to. Now, how amazing that, you've got to say that is great literature. If you've managed to capture the ideal to which all nations today are trying to aspire to. So that was our third one, Utopia by Thomas More. Next up on our list, just after Thomas More, is the King James Bible. Actually, I should be more specific. I really should say William Tyndale's Bible, because 90% of the King James Authorised Version came from William Tyndale, who only a few years before had been burnt at the stake for translating the Bible into English. And that brings me on to the first point. The Bible is not a work of English. It's a work of Hebrew and Greek and a little bit of Aramaic. But the reason it's on this list, and it's also not classed as fiction, but the reason it's on this list is twofold. It's not simply that it was translated, it was the style of the translation. William Tyndale wanted to allow a mere ploughboy to be able to read and understand the Word of God in his own tongue. Now, to do that, he had to skip around being convoluted in his translation of the Greek and the Hebrew into some scholastic large wordy volume. He had to make it memorable. Now, granted, a lot of the Hebrew poetry and the Greek renditions made a lot of that possible, but when you read the King James Version, like the original, the rhythm that you find is so attuned to the English ear. You'll get almost like iambic pentameter going through it. And it makes it memorable. And just the sheer brilliance of the translation probably added so much to the impact of the Bible on later works of literature and society. So that's one part. That's why I put it in this as English, is because of the translation itself that Tyndale made. The second point is, although it wasn't written by the English or in English originally, and it's not fiction, it's just simply too prominent a book not to have in this list. No other book has had such an influence on literature, schools of thought, as the Bible. No other book has been probably hated as much as the Bible either, and, attacked. The irony is, we just talked about Thomas More. In Utopia, he espouses religious freedom. Everyone's allowed as moon worshippers, sun worshippers, animal worshippers. But he, strangely enough, despite espousing this in Utopia, he actually wrote letters condemning Tyndale for trying to write the Bible in the English language. He was very much on the get the heretics side of things. Anyway, going back to the Bible. If you're going to read the Bible, it's a massive book if you want to cover it for literature. So rather than read all of it, because books like Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Ezekiel, Revelation is grand to look at, but complicated. The Pauline letters, the 14 letters by the Apostle Paul, they deal with intricacies of Hebrew law and how it translates to the Christian way. So if you're going to read the Bible or get some background from it, I would recommend these parts. Genesis. That's a really important book because it's alluded to a lot in literature. The Gospels. So that's Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, which form the accounts of Jesus Christ on earth. The Psalms, also massively alluded to in literature. And then there are a couple of other books you may want to go further on. So Ruth is one, Esther is another one. The book of Proverbs is just wise sayings. Now, what I want to say about the Bible itself, as a work of literature, not going either whether you believe it or whether you don't believe it, a lot is said about the Bible. What I will say, it does have a uniting message. A lot of people just say it's a disparate concoction. Having that attitude will undermine your understanding of allusions to it in literature. The Bible itself, although written by 40 different men over the period of 1600 years, it actually does have a uniting idea behind it. There's actually one single verse in the Bible that all the others tie to. Did you know that? But this is often overlooked when anyone talks about the Western canon. But I would just say that you go to those books if you want a background in the influences of English literature. Out of all the books on this list, this one is by far and away the most influential. Because of course it was held by practically everyone as the Word of God. So naturally it's going to hold a bit of a high position in people's minds. But a lot of societies, well, we'll talk the English speaking world and the Western world, its moral code, its structure of civilization has been shaped by the Bible. fundamentally a lot of the basic laws are scriptural. So that's why it's such an important book, why it's one of the greats, is because it has such a far-reaching effect into our everyday life, whether we're believers or not. Our next work of great English literature is written around the same time that the Bible was translated into English, and that is the complete works of William Shakespeare. I had to put the complete works in. There was no way I could just pick Hamlet or Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet. The works of Shakespeare are just a phenomenon. The man who wrote this, whoever he may be after all the arguments, was just amazing. His insight into the human condition was, in my opinion, is unmatched. It's certainly unmatched in the English-speaking world. And he covers all areas of the human life with great insight and depth of feeling. He allows you to touch, to grasp, to hold up and feel all of the virtues and vices of humanity and to consider them. You know, you've got loyalty, you've got the nobility of Henry V, what you would call his ideal Christian king, as it were, marrying the power of the throne with the religiosity of the church. You've got the hubris of Richard II. You've got the ambition of Macbeth. You've got the moral dilemma of Hamlet and doing what is right. You know, conscience plays such a fierce role in that, as indeed it does in Macbeth, the role of conscience. You've got the problem of jealousy in Othello. You've got the family problems in King Lear. You've got the hijinks of the comedy of errors, which I actually love to bits. And amongst all of this, just the most brilliant use of language. The rhythm, the heart-beating iambic pentameter. By the way, if this is the first time you're watching me, please, please, please go and watch my video on what is iambic pentameter, as in Shakespeare explained. Iambic pentameter, I think, is what I've called it. It will give you the most extensive explanation of iambic pentameter on YouTube that I've seen. And then there's just the sheer brilliance of his similes, his metaphors, his turns of phrase, so vivid, so simple, that we use them now, like 400 years later. They're that good. Have you ever said to someone, good riddance? You're quoting Troilus and Cressida by William Shakespeare. Okay? Music is the food of love. That's Twelfth Night. Have you ever said to someone that they've led you on a wild goose chase? You're quoting Mercutio from Romeo and Juliet. Okay? We Band of Brothers. That's Henry V. Forever and a Day. That's a Shakespeare. I think At the Drop of a Hat, I think, is Shakespeare as well. You know, this guy turned up with so many phrases. He's just a prodigy, an absolute marvel that only seems to come along like once every 1,000 years. Shakespeare also is alluded to so much through the rest of literature, including the world's literature. The complete works of Shakespeare and the Bible, those two works are alluded to probably more than all others in literature. Of course, you've got the Greeks as well from way back, but those two in English literature are alluded to all the time. And so if you really want to get to grips with English literature, get deep into it, then slowly work your way through the works of Shakespeare. So here's a surprise, the lighting is different and I'm wearing different clothes. That's because the next book that I'm about to mention, I accidentally deleted while editing. So I've got to do it again the next day. And that book is John Milton's Paradise Lost. John Milton is the great poet of the English. He wrote Paradise Lost as an epic poem. He did it deliberately. He wrote it in blank verse, which has a meter but deliberately doesn't rhyme. Now, in doing this, he was trying to copy Homer with his Odyssey and Virgil and the old Greeks with their epics. And he was asked, why have you decided to make this poem not rhyme? He could have just said, because I didn't want it to rhyme. But he actually said, I want to liberate poetry and the English language from the tyranny of rhyming. And he felt that the greatest stories were, like the Greeks, best told without rhyme, but structured in a particular way that carried the force of feeling and greatness and grandeur of the story. Now, the story itself, Paradise Lost, is about the fall of man, Adam and Eve in the Bible, being tempted by Satan, the devil. And Paradise Lost actually starts before that takes place. It comes to it, but it starts before, with Satan and God having a falling out and a war in heaven, and Satan losing, getting cast to hell. And then he's got this massive chip on his shoulder and broods an awful lot about himself and tries to justify his acts. And it's not my place here to be talking about what the whole story is about. But the reason Milton wrote it, he said, is he wanted to justify God's actions to men. Because clearly we live in a world in which, if there was a benevolent creator, this world doesn't seem to match that idea. And you've got to remember, with Milton, this is the time when the English had gone through the Civil War. There'd been a lot of bloodshed, a lot of cruelty enacted. Milton and things had reversed again after this with the restoration of the monarchy. So humans, men and women, were confused with the world, and what he was writing, they were familiar with Bible story, but he was trying to do an exposition on it. It's almost an apologetic, you could say. What's interesting, though, is how people have interpreted this epic poem. Some come down on the thought that Milton was on the side of Satan, whereas others say no, clearly he wasn't. But you'd have to read that and judge that for yourself. It's one of the things about literature, unless you know the author directly, you bring to bear on it a lot of your own views and prejudices. Now, the book itself, if you were to get into it and decide to read it, be prepared to be very, very confused. It's written as a poem. It's written as an epic, which is not necessarily the best way to tell a story in terms of clarity. And then it's full of ornate language and various kinds of rhythm, which are not always pleasing to our ear, not in our modern day anyway. But even when he wrote it, people complained. Like the guy who printed it said, I don't know what it means, because there's a layering up of clause upon clause. I think some critic once says these clauses up here, as if they don't know where they came from and stand there embarrassed in the stanza. But then they're given a relief at the end of each stanza. So this is not a work you simply just sit down and read lightly. It's one that you have to go to and maybe take it a bit at a time. What's remarkable, considering it's about the fall, by the way, of Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge of good and bad, is that Adam and Eve don't turn up until like 3/4 of the way through the book. It all gives a huge background to Satan himself. And Milton appears in the poem. He stops and tells you about what it's like to write the poem. The journey that he's going on. In some respects, this is an epic novel about writing an epic novel, as well as recounting the scriptural story. And I just have to say, it's not the scriptural story. There is a lot where Milton has read into it. He's trying to get to grips with God's ideas of justice and Satan's challenge to God's authority, so that he can explain this to the common man in epic verse. But what he ends up completing is the great British epic. It's a work of poetry which has endured and inspired poet after poet, both believer and non-believer. You know, you think of Percy Shelley, he thought this work was wonderful. Percy Shelley was an atheist. And yet you've got others who were devout and they thought it was wonderful for the opposite reasons that Shelley did. One thing they could agree on was the masterliness, the masterful handling of the language and the beauty which the language pulls up. But like I say, when you read it, it's going to make you slow right down. There may not be any other work in English that we can actually easily read, which is so hard to get through if you're not ready for it. With the exception of if you're going back to reading old Anglo-Saxon like Beowulf, if you would have to learn a new language essentially there. I'm talking, it's a language you recognise on the page, but the meanings, there's a lot to get your head around. However, it's an absolute gargantuan piece, edifice in English literature, and undoubtedly, I don't think anyone could argue that it shouldn't be in the top 10 works in the English language. For our next work, we are jumping right forward to the 19th century, right at the beginning of the 19th century. That's jumping over an awful lot of great works in the meantime. And the one I'm going to pick, it was a toss-up actually between two. So I'm going to mention a bonus one here. The one I left out, which perhaps could have or should have even made it to this list, was Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne. But that wasn't the one I put on this list. The one I put on this list comes just shortly after, and it's Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. There's something about Pride and Prejudice. It's its effect on the novel. You've got the first person narrative, which before Pride and Prejudice was, and at the time of, was still the primary mode of narration, the first person. The third person omniscient, you know, the godlike perspective that knows the thoughts of everybody, that is used. But Jane Austen uses a feature of narration which, although she's not the maker of it, it happened done before, she used it so effortlessly. It's almost as if she didn't actually do it thinkingly. And that is free indirect speech. I should do a short video on this. I always say short, it always ends up going on half an hour. Free indirect speech. This is when you've got a third person narrator who looks at you from a distance but can suddenly zoom in and read the thoughts of the character. So we suddenly get a close-up. So you could say that Lizzie Bennet walked into the room and her mother was crocheting a blanket. Now that's just third person, it's observation. But if it said Lizzie Bennet walked into the room and her crusty old mother sat knitting an horrific crochet monstrosity, I've described the same thing, but the words I'm using clearly have to come from the protagonist Lizzie. You know, crusty is a descriptive word, it's not just the narrator observing. That monstrosity is clearly Lizzie's feelings towards this crochet blanket. This is free indirect speech. It allows the narrator to sort of drop into the mind of the main character and come back out, zooming in and out, making us feel more psychologically involved in the drama. And it can mislead us as well. It's a great use for making dramatic irony. Jane Austen uses this throughout her works, and she uses it effortlessly. After Jane Austen, who wasn't received too well in her time, she's later discovered and absolutely praised to the high heavens for this, and lots of people use this Austenite free indirect speech. And so I picked Pride and Prejudice because it's the first one of hers, and it's also the narrative style that she uses, which is now so commonplace to us, yet wasn't in its day, that in that respect, I don't know to what extent it influenced lots of others, but if it did, then that makes it a seriously great work of English literature for the effect it had on narration going forward. We're jumping further along in the 19th century now, and we're coming to the great English writer Charles Dickens, and I've picked for this one David Copperfield. Now, a subscriber who watches this channel, Troy, big shout out for you, makes some amazing observations about books. He got in touch with me when I released this list on a little short video, and he said, David Copperfield, really? He says, I wouldn't even say it's one of Dickens' best works, let alone part of the Big Ten. And I responded to him saying, in some respects, I think I'd agree, it's not his best work, so why pick it? It's because it's almost the totem of Charles Dickens. You know, the icon that is Charles Dickens. David Copperfield is semi-autobiographical. It follows the story of young David trying to make his way in the world through the ups and downs, the vicissitudes of life, the slings and arrows of fate, and how he rides with these, how he progresses, how he goes back, how he meets characters who dissemble and lie and are not what they appear, and how he meets others who he thinks are not good and have got a bit of a shady past who turn out to be good. What happens in David Copperfield is it sort of summarises everything that Dickens is about. I couldn't put the complete works of Charles Dickens in this, because not all of his works are worthy, in my opinion, although I love him to bits. But what Dickens does across his literature is he creates characters like you just wouldn't believe. Some people don't like them. They say they're grotesque, they're caricatures. The reason they're caricatures is because just like a cartoonist takes one feature of your face and blows it out of proportion, and everyone looking at that picture goes, yeah, that's you, even though you might have a nose 7 times bigger than your head in a cartoon. Dickens does that with characters from everyday life, which we all instantly recognise. And what that allows you to do through Dickens' works, and he does it better than anybody else, is he allows you to get into the psychology of your protagonist, who is always an ordinary character, but he allows you to touch and feel the aura and the psychology of the other people you interact with in the book. He allows you to literally stand in the streets of London in the middle of Victorian England and mix with those people as if they're as close and real as your next door neighbours. What Dickens does in his works is he takes characterisation to a new level. Now, of course, some people, they don't quite like that style of characterisation. Many authors might have criticised him for not being realistic enough. But most authors across Europe, Tolstoy thought Dickens was the greatest, amongst the greatest. And the reason for that was his ability to love his characters and make you emotionally connect with the character. And everyone really, when they wrote a character from this point going forward, once they'd read Dickens, they knew what a character had to be. Now, if you could make it more real, great, but you had to connect to them like Dickens could get you to connect to his characters. And that shaped a lot of literature. The undercurrents of Dickens is felt everywhere. Also, he plays into the national psyche. Christmas would not be the way it is without Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol. Not because it's tradition, but because people were losing interest in Christmas before he released the Christmas Carol. And then we just have all these names that he comes out with, which are part of the common vernacular, really, in English as well. You think of an Artful Dodger. It's a naughty little pickpocket street urchin, isn't it? And Oliver Twist is some poor ragged little child. So he introduced or put into sublime vision a lot of the identities of humanity. And so I picked David Copperfield, not because it's necessarily his best one. Some think that. Great Expectations is another great one. Bleak House is another fantastic one. But David Copperfield is the story of Dickens himself. And that's why I put it on this list. There you will see a person trying to make their way. It's Dickens' actual life, but written with all the beautiful characters that only Dickens could write so well. Our next book is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Now you might say that's American, not British. I did say English literature. This is, I know you could call it American literature. I mean works written in English. Now Moby Dick, that is 1.5 books. That's a seriously powerful piece of literature. This opened up, it goes beyond psychological. This is almost the meaning of life kind of stuff. We've got this monomaniac, which is always how he's described. Captain Ahab of the Pequod, who wants to go after this white whale that sinks ships, which actually stoved in his ship and caused him injury, and he wants revenge. But you've got the narrator, who's the somewhat ordinary, slightly boring Ishmael. And he's just looking for a sense of adventure. He often gets to this point where he says he feels like he would commit suicide. Life has no meaning. So he goes and puts himself into an adventurous situation, which is dangerous. And so working on a whaling boat in the middle of the 19th century, that was dangerous work, also in the freezing conditions, setting sail from Nantucket. So what we get is this group of disparate characters on the Pequod. And you've got the great Queequeg, the cannibal, the noble cannibal. They're all on this boat, and you are trapped in a very isolated, dreary, grey, misty, flat sometimes world. You have the inner churnings of not just the author, of the narrator, but you can sense the inner feelings of the crew as well. The discontent, the malcontent, the uneasiness of being with Ahab, this monomaniac after his whale. But all set in this broad expanse of ocean. And what it gives birth to is a novel that grows almost too large for a shelf to contain. It takes you down to the rudiments of humanity, what we are inside. This adventure we call life, which is full of threat, obsessions, uneasy interactions. What is the symbolism of the ocean and of the whale? There's a question that goes in there. That's been debated a lot. The differences of character. Like, I think of Queequeg. Naturally, he would be somewhat on the outsides of society because he's not white. But his nobility, and it's so beautifully handled through Ishmael's narration because it makes you realise we are all human. We all experience things the same, really. And this is where classic literature is great, because classic literature transcends race, it transcends boundaries, it transcends economic status. People who just say this is written by a white person, it doesn't matter. Queequeg could be white and Ishmael could be black. The story would not change one bit. We resonate with the emotions, with the feelings, with the understanding of being brought close, almost to a frosted mirror of ourselves, seeing the hazy outline of what we truly are within. And this is particularly encapsulated in Moby Dick because of the sheer vastness of the landscape and yet the claustrophobic narrowness of the scene, which is stuck on the Pequod. And like I say, written with the most beautiful prose in places that you will ever come across. It showed to other authors at the end of the 19th century just what could be accomplished with a novel. And that would take off with the modernists. And you'd end up getting to books like Ulysses, although written in a totally different style, the greatness of it. And one thing I will say about Moby Dick, if you think of Northrop Frye, is the great literary critic, he talks about his 5 modes of the tale, and he comes to the bottom one, the ironic one, which descends somehow circularly into the top one of legend by using an ordinary man. Moby Dick's like this. They are ordinary men, somewhat outcast. Ahab's a bit weird, and yet from that looking down on someone who's mental, he turns into this legend. He comes in at the top mode in Frye's sort of 5 modes of literature. So that's the next one. That was Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And now we come to our 10th of the 10 greatest classic books in English literature. And I'm keeping it within the 19th century. I've mentioned Ulysses, that could go in this, but it's 20th century. I wanted to stop in the 19th. And this book is George Eliot's Middlemarch. Some class this as the greatest novel ever written in the English language. The full title of this book is important when telling you why it's on this list. It's Middlemarch, a study of provincial life. Provincial means everything outside the capital, really. And this takes place in a made-up town, Middlemarch, in the Midlands, which is pretty much like Coventry, because that was down the road from George Eliot. She was born in Nuneaton. And she actually had friends in little villages, which are now inside the great city of Coventry. In fact, one of her friends was a cobbler, whose name was George Eliot. So maybe that's where she got her name from. Now, the study in provincial life, it does follow four main characters. But instead of going through the story, I'll tell you why it's a work of great literature. It's its scope and its unmatchable observation. She wrote a realist book in Middlemarch, which you could say has never been matched. She observes the attitude of so many parts of society. She observes the role of sex in society. She observes the role of marriage, the role of religion, the role of academia, the role of commerce, the role of agriculture, the growth of city, the shrinking of the pastoral way of living. She covers so much. She was criticised in her day by some writers by saying her book's disjointed and one chapter goes into the other but without making any sense. If you've read Middlemarch, you'll know what they mean by that. But it does make sense. However, it's not plot driven. So although there is a plot, a thread, two main threads going through the book with four main characters, she is also just observing how life sweeps through. How if we were to zone in on someone, hone in on someone, we might be able to make a story out of them. But that isn't actually life, really, is it? Life is something that is happening of which we are merely a cork bobbing around in a tumultuous sea. But she comes in and analyses some of those lives. That holds an interest to us. But by doing it, she incorporates so much of the way of life that people are living. And again, this is what makes classic literature so great, is it makes us reflect on life. It puts life in front of us to experience. It helps open ourselves up to ourselves. We begin to identify with emotions inside the protagonists or the antagonists. And it causes us to question ourselves. Do we identify with them? Do we not? Do we hope they go one way and not the other? You know, the ending of Middlemarch is so disappointing to some people, but unbelievably real, considering what date it was meant to be taking place in. And the truth that George Eliot keeps on this book, keeping herself from infecting it with her desires, colouring it with her observations. It's an outstanding piece of work. So, there are the 10 greatest classic books in the English language. You'll notice that 6 of them go back to the year 600 and before. It's because they are so foundational to the literature that we have now and the way we see things now. Of course, one book goes back thousands of years, that's the Bible, but the translation into English had a massive effect on changing the English-speaking peoples of the world. If you really want to get into literature, if you're really looking to, like I say, make a deep, deep, deep foundation and you're prepared to put in a bit of the work, go back to these books at some point. Now, are there any books on this list that you would like me to go into further in a different video? If there are, please put your comments down below. Until the next time I see you on video, I wish you joy in your reading.